The title of this talk is what an Islamic historian's view of what, social mobilization? Okay. When I made that the title of the talk, I thought the Islamic historian I was talking about was me. Now that I'm standing here, it no longer is quite that apparent. Instead, I'm thinking back to the probably the early 1950s, and I'm thinking about a great Arabist of the past generation, Franz Rosenthal at Yale. At that time, Rosenthal was engaged in translating the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun, which became one of the most important works, really a necessary read for everybody who does Islamic history. And Rosenthal was dealing, like every translator before him in every language, with the question of how do you translate Asabiyya? And he chose badly. He said, well, let's call it group feeling. Group feeling, you sit around the bridge table, you have group feeling. When you go to a church service, you might have group feeling. When you vote, who knows? Group feeling, it didn't convey much of anything. I remember Sir Hamilton Gibb being critical of Rosenthal's translation. I think that was, as I recall, one of his criticisms. Not that Gibb had a better translation. In French, it was called esprit de corps, which made you think it was all about military stuff. But it's a problematic word. The proper translation of Asabiyya is social mobilization. I have now resolved the fundamental ambiguity of this conference. Thank you very much. But I'm serious. If someone with a social science perspective were to look at his work now and think of it in those terms, they would discover that Asabiyya is a far richer concept than it appears in a superficial reading of the book, where it seems to deal only with the rise and fall of political dynasties. Now, the reason I think that that this is not a mutilating Ibn Khaldun's thought, is that I think that Ibn Khaldun knew perfectly well that what he was coming up with this term Asabiyya was more complex than it would appear. Ibn Khaldun lived between 1332 and 1406, so he died 2 years after Tamerlane, Timur, whom he met in Damascus. So even though he was a Tunisian of Andalusian background, he was interested and familiar with affairs in the eastern lands, had traveled there, and certainly had read the histories and so on. After all, his book, the Muqaddimah, was an introduction to world history. It wasn't supposed to be simply something about North Africa. He came from a intellectual perspective, following upon Ibn Tufayl and Ibn Rushd, people in the Andalusian, North African intellectual milieu who were interested in seeing in the world of phenomena the action of what we would call natural laws. In other words, how does God's footprint in the world look, and can you divine it simply from looking at the phenomena around you? And I think that that is what he thought he was doing. And yet I'll come back to this. and the relationship it has to Islam in a bit. As I say, I think Ibn Khaldun was perfectly aware that there was a special complexity about this term. Because even though it is a term that in his usage refers to the quality that makes a challenging political entity capable of overthrowing an existing government, that is not the word, that is not the meaning that that Arabic word had in previous centuries. If you go back to the 10th century, the 11th century, the 12th century, a couple of hundred years before Ibn Khaldun, you find the word used not infrequently in texts relating to the history of the ulama in the eastern lands of the Islamic Empire. It refers to intense activities by urban groups whose passions border on fanaticism and zealotry. In other words, you have people who are getting involved in murderous disputes, and it'll be said, well, he was killed because of asabiya. Or you'll have a adjective like wahshi used, wildness used to describe an asabiya. An asabiya was a movement, certainly, but it was a very active one, and one that was given to passion to the point of violence. The related word from the same root, ta'assub, is the current Arabic word for fanaticism. There is clearly a relationship here. So Ibn Khaldun was taking a word that was already current in Arabic usage, and he was looking at a history of people who acted violently and acted on the basis of intensity of feeling, and he was saying, well, you know, those same passions that in one sense, in one context, we identify as being fanatical or overly zealous, they can also be constructive. Because sometimes these guys win, and they create a new order. And one of the things about the Asabiya of Ibn Khaldun is that while he portrays it as a positive force that makes possible the circulation of government over time, he was certainly also aware that it is a violent and an aggressive and negative force in other contexts. In other words, Asabiya has the core of it is precisely the action, rather than simply a passive feeling. This is the reason I like mobilization rather than feeling. Group feeling is passive. Mobilization is active. But it's also the action of groups. So social mobilization. But it goes beyond that, because when you look into the details of how Ibn Khaldun construes the meaning of the word as he writes about it in Muqaddimah, and you have to remember this is an introduction to history. It is not an introduction, it's an introduction to the history of the world. It's not an introduction to simply to the history of Islamic politics. I mean, I'm sure he thought that his notion of how states rise and fall applied outside the Islamic world as well as inside. So when you look at his work in greater detail, one of the things that is clear is that he is very interested in process rather than in motivation or ideology these are really very vague. He doesn't say why people become engaged in social mobilization, but he talks about what happens when they do. One of the things that's very clear, since in his model he's talking about social mobilization, I'm going to use this term now instead of asabiyya. He's talking about social mobilization as something that occurs in the desert and takes over the city, replacing the previous rulers. I take this to be metaphorical as well as realistic, and I think it's fairly clear that that's the case because the word desert does not describe those people who aren't living in the city. You have people in the city and people in the desert, and in between you have almost all the entire populations living in villages and farming and so on and so on. So he's using, I think, desert in a figurative sense for those people who are who feel the most left out of whatever power complex there is. So that metaphorically you could say, well, you know, the poor are the desert, or the minorities are the desert, or women are the desert. You know, those people who have the least stake in the existing order and the greatest reason to want to see it altered or replaced. He sees asabiyya, or social mobilization, as something in which a single large movement can supervene over a number of smaller movements. So he'll talk about how you have asabiyat, you have the group feeling of a number of groups, and then something happens to draw them together, and you get a synergy that comes about by cementing together different currents of social mobilization into one large current. And I think this is something that fits well with numerous examples of modern times of social mobilization, where you have a kind of collection of motives and of currents that will be drawn together under usually a symbolic or titular leader. I'm thinking here, for example, of the Iranian Revolution, where certainly everyone did not expect the ulama to come out on top. You know, it was a collection of groups that saw Khomeini as their titular leader, but not necessarily the person who would dominate them. So he recognizes that a social movement, a social motivation, social mobilization can be an umbrella that draws together people of different backgrounds. In his construction, religion is the one example he gives of what can motivate this supervening form of social mobilization, but as I say, I'll come back to religion in a bit. Next, it's very clear that he is aware that time is a function, is important here. One of the things that has struck me in a number of the discussions we've had earlier today about social movements is how a number of people describe them as sort of existing forces rather than dynamic forces that rise and fall. And that a movement can come from nothing, can rise, and it can succeed or fail. It's not going to last forever. It will come to an end. And one of the, I think, most important insights of Ibn Khaldun is his awareness that social mobilization begins and ends. And he describes this, says he's dealing with a what is primarily political model. He describes this in terms of generations. So that you have the first generation, which is gaining strength, the second generation takes over, the third generation wallows in luxury and loses its zeal, and in the fourth generation, the fervor is gone, and something else can come along. He, for reasons I'll get into, defines a generation as being 40 years long. But I don't think that that's the crucial thing, partly because the Hafsid dynasty that he worked for through his professional career in government had been around for way longer than 4 generations. In other words, it was not a current model for the North Africa they lived in. And indeed, it would be hard to find a model that would really fit terribly well from the world of his own political experience. So I take the 4 generations to be metaphorical. And saying what we're dealing here with is, using the biological metaphor, it would be infancy, adolescence, let us say the process of becoming adult, maturity, senescence, the becoming old, and then marcescence, which is not a very common word in English, but it's the word for becoming dead. And it's used by botanists for leaves on trees that have died but have not yet fallen. And this is exactly how Ibn Khaldun describes the 4th generation of a polity when all the gas has gone out of the balloon and it's just ready to fall. So if you look at it that way, then you say, okay, a social mobilization movement. That doesn't sound very good. Anyway, social mobilization will have a beginning. It will gain a robust identity. Then it will kind of peak. And then it will go past its peak. And the decline will be evident. It may achieve its goal or it may not. But there will still have this, this trajectory. One of the things that Ibn Khaldun observes is that in the 3rd generation, you're likely to have force used by centralized power. So that you have, let us say, socialized power in the second, in the first and second generations, that everyone is in it together. And then once success is gained, or once the zeal begins to go, that's when you may have people who become violent as a last-ditch effort to preserve whatever they got. And then it comes to an end. There's another way to look at this, and this comes from a lot of thinking that I've done about the process of conversion to Islam, which you could see as a social mobilization, if you wish, in a given region. It's a slow one. It's not a matter of 4 generations. It might be a matter, as it was for medieval Middle East, a matter of 4 centuries rather than 4 generations. And yet you could still see that you have an infancy that is open to a certain amount of zealotry. You have a sort of bandwagon effect that comes in. You have great success. And then toward the end, when most people have already made their commitment to Islam, you have Islam becoming kind of open to staid conservative late converts who want a staid conservative religion. But I described all this in terms of a curve that would be a bell-shaped distribution curve, which can be integrated into an S-shaped curve. And I tied this into a current of theoretical writing that deals with innovation diffusion. In the 20th century, S-shaped innovation curves became extremely important in a number of fields. Technological diffusion used it all the time. Advertising used it. Epidemiologists use the curve. And basically, it turned out to describe pretty much the way anything starts and then tapers off. The original model of it was fruit flies in a bottle with a certain amount of food. You start out with 2 fruit flies. They propagate like fruit flies, so they grow sort of exponentially, and then a lot of fruit flies, and then the food runs out and they all die. And you count fruit flies, and it turns out it's an S-shaped curve. I remember when I wrote my book on this, I was warned by people do not talk about fruit flies and epidemic disease in describing the spread of Islam. This would be a very unpopular thing to do. But when you look at the literature relating to this sort of diffusion curve, this is what you get. So that, say someone did an S-shaped diffusion curve studying how rapidly did people discover that John F. Kennedy was dead. And you had an S-shaped curve that ran over about 24 hours, as opposed to 4 centuries or 4 generations or something like that. There's a reason for this. And the underlying reason is information theory. How do people cannot know something until they hear about it or experience it. And therefore the time factor relating to social mobilization is partly a function of the information environment in which the mobilization occurs. And there are 2 aspects of this. One is, of course, means of communication. So that for Ibn Khaldun, you're basically talking about word of mouth. And if you're talking about word of mouth, then you're talking about a physical space in which you have word of mouth contact within a village, within a tribe, within a trading network, something like that. Because people need to find out about something if they're going to be drawn into it. But as time goes on, and particularly as you get down to modern times, when you have print media, and then broadcast media, and now electronic media, the access to information becomes faster and faster, and the spatial element with respect to who might know what when becomes less and less important, to the point where, for example, one Saudi newspaper reportedly published the information about the overthrow of the Ikhwan regime in Egypt and the rise of General Sisi several hours before it happened. How exactly the Saudis would have known this, who knows? But more seriously, you can also know something that's happened in Cairo as quickly anywhere in this country as you can anywhere in Cairo if you're tied into that information network. So in other words, Ibn Khaldun, in thinking of social mobilization, was aware that of time and space. And one of the things that I think is important in that regard is that as we look over the full range of Islamic history and at the myriad movements that have taken place, and looking at those that that can fit into this sort of social mobilization theory, whether they are political or non-political. I think we have to recognize that the information technology and the information regime and the importance of personal contact changes over time, so that a movement that can take place in 3 months in 2011 might have taken place in a much more extended period of time, 200 years earlier. Now, when in Ibn Khaldun's model, a social mobilization phenomenon meets with success, the success brings with it luxury. It doesn't, it's interesting that he focuses on luxury rather than on ideological triumph. Because I think he's trying to describe what he thinks really happens in the world. And there's an awareness that the ideology is not necessarily the crucial element in holding things together. And the ideology might not triumph, even though the movement succeeds. But there will be benefits that accrue to a movement as it succeeds. And those benefits will be distributed or maldistributed. And those who get the benefits will experience a weakening of their zeal, because benefits are real and ideological triumph can be illusory. So he makes a very strong argument that in social mobilization of the sort he's talking about, or I believe he's talking about, you go from what he calls desert privation, from a profound have-not status, to being people who now have. And this saps the zeal of the movement. So those who have are likely to try to institutionalize or routinize their success in a way that preserves their interest as the new haves. And some of their zealous followers will simply be left out. I bring to mind here Asef Bayat's book on the poor in the Iranian Revolution, and how the people who lived in the shanty towns of southern Tehran and the pushcart vendors and so forth had been strongly in favor of the revolution, and then discovered that actually the new winners did not, also wanted to have zoning laws and things like that would not be in the interest of the poor. And so the poor lost their zeal. They went from the doctrine of na gharbi, na sharqi, no west, no east, to na gharbi, na sharqi, na albi, na barqi, no west, no east, no water, no electricity. And you make a nice coda to that experience. All right. I'm not going to try and draw this part of the talk any further. What I'm trying to conclude here, though, is that, let us say, by a happy coincidence, Franz Rosenthal had hit on social mobilization instead of group feeling. And totally independently, Chuck Tilley or someone like that had hit on social mobilization at the same time. And then somebody, because, my late colleague Chuck Tilley, I was not a Middle East specialist, at some point, someone in our profession looked and said, well, look, here's social mobilization and here's social mobilization. They have it in European tradition, they have it in the Middle Eastern tradition. What do we do with that? Of course, one of the things that comes to my mind is how when something, when some intellectual or theoretical enterprise comes up that uses terminology rooted, that's rooted in the European tradition, the words used to describe it are categorical. Like it's not European social mobilization, it's social mobilization. This is the way societies mobilize. And what Arabs do is asabiya. Let them have their funny little Arabic word, or the group feeling that Rosenthal gave them, because in the heart of hearts of Western academia, there is still this privileging of the European tradition that will probably be with us for a long time to come. And yet, if Tilly had used social mobilization, and Rosenthal had, and somebody said, well, look, here you have social mobilization, and we can go back to the French Revolution, and the stories of the crowd, and association in Europe, and so forth, and that social mobilization. And now here we have someone else who's talking about social mobilization 600 years earlier, and he's talking about how you can have a movement that rises and falls and changes this and that, and it's rooted in concept of zealotry and so forth. Then somebody might say, well, is the European tradition necessary to get to the concept of social mobilization? Or could it have been, or could it be something that's always been there and has been universal, and you don't need to have that set of examples or models in order to get there? Or is there something about the Islamic world that would make an Ibn Khaldunian rendition of social mobilization different in a significant way from a European rooted version of the same term? And I would suggest yes. I think there is. And it partly comes from what seems to me to be almost true by definition. It partly comes from these two different portrayals of what I think is probably a more or less common phenomenon, having unspoken or even spoken roots in paradigms. In other words, a Western derived concept of social mobilization is going to have to make room for the French Revolution, or for the Civil Rights Movement, or for Gandhi. You can't come up with a term and use it without it satisfying certain desiderata with respect to the real world that you know about in recent history. But you don't have to make room for Muhammad. Ibn Khaldun had to make room for the paradigm that you have for the Islamic world. And that is the experience of Muhammad and his community. So when you look at, even though he never says so, you work out the chronology. He says each of these generations is 40 years long. And then he gives a Quranic quote saying, because 40 is the number of years that the children of Israel wandered in the wilderness of Sinai. Because that was how long they had to wait for the generation to pass away before entering into the promised land. So we know a generation is 40 years because it's in the Quran. And we have 3 generations before you get to the stage of marcescence. And so you plug that into the chronology of early Islam, and it really works very well. makes a difference whether you start with first Revelation 6:10 or with the Hijra in 6:22, but it doesn't make all that much difference. You go along and say, well, yeah, these turning points, when you get to that third generation, now the Umayyads are in power and they're using the force of the Syrian Jund to impose their will on the rest of the Muslim world, and then another 40 years and they're ready to be overthrown by the Abbasids. It works surprisingly well. It works pretty well for Abbasid history as well, 40 by 40 by 40. It doesn't work terribly well for the North African dynasties. It actually works better in the Central Middle East than it does in North Africa. But I think that this goes back, the need to have this fit the paradigm. Also the idea of a religious prophet supervening over the separate tribal Asabiyas of Arabia. This is part of it. But the reason for this is that you go back to the idea of discovering the truth of God's revelation in natural law. And what is the paramount manifestation of God's will on earth in a Muslim tradition? It's the life of the prophet. So even though he never says, I'm deriving this theory from the history of early Islam, the theory has to make room for that history. And I would suggest that despite the similarities that I feel exist between social mobilization as it's construed in a Western tradition and social mobilization as it is construed as I'm construing it in over 14 centuries of Islamic tradition, despite the similarities, somehow on the Islamic side, there is always room for some aspect of religion, and on the European side, that is not desideratum. There is no pressing need. Now, you can find examples. You can say, okay, well, the temperance movement in America, good example of social mobilization with religious strain leading it, or the anti-abortion movement. But you don't say, well, we have to have a theory that accommodates these, because these are not as important as some of the others, and they're kind of outliers compared with other social mobilization experiences. Whereas on the Islamic side, I think there is a greater inclination to think that the way world affairs works is ultimately continues to be affected by God's vouchsafing Muhammad to the community of Muslims. That there is going to be room for religion. It doesn't mean that religion will dominate. It doesn't mean religion will, in a pluralistic context, that religion will succeed all the time. But it's going to be there. Now let me make one final point. Oh, I've been talking too long. Because the time span for Islamic history is so long compared to the sort of eye blink of, say, American history, it is unquestionably true that if you take Ibn Khaldun's model, either realistically or metaphorically, and say that is Islamic social mobilization, then clearly it goes through phases. And those phases relate to some things discussed earlier, like institutions and ideology and language and so forth and so on. And they also relate to issues of what is the objective. So for Ibn Khaldun, he says the objective is the power of the state. But if one were to say, well, supposing the objective is simply power, is the state the only holder of power that is important enough for people to compete? And here I go back to what I said earlier about the word asabiya in pre-Ibn Khaldunian usage, is that the asabiyas that were experienced in the eastern part of the Arab world and in Iran were not over state power. They were over which madhab will dominate. So that somebody in a talk earlier today was saying how, of course, all of the Sunni law schools are equally tolerant of each other. Well, they become so, but that's in their Marcescent state, so to speak, because there was a time when Hanafis and Shafis killed each other. Lots of them killed each other. Times when they would set up catapults on the walls and bombard each other's mosques, bombard each other's madrasas, murder one another in the street. Times that seem more than anything like Beirut between 1975 and 1990, where it wasn't a matter of seeking absolute state power. It was a matter of seeking trying to get a hegemonic position within a religious social environment where control of the state was not a question, because the Turks were doing that, and they weren't. Nobody's going to challenge the Turks, but there was other sorts of power. So we had periods when you could fight over madhab and have this kind of movement. And there are certainly Sufi brotherhoods that experience things like this. I think that Ahmed's description of the brotherhood was superb. The only thing I missed in it was times when the brotherhood gets violent and seeks some sort of hegemony, which occurs in various places. Certainly occurred in Morocco vis-a-vis foreigners, and in the fact that Sufi brotherhoods take a lead in many parts of the world in opposing European imperialism, I think has to be taken into consideration in thinking about what is a brotherhood. But you also have a movement that takes place when a shrine is set up in a new area. I mean, it builds its clientele, and that's another kind of power. It's a sort of spiritual power. So I think that the character of social mobilization in the Islamic world changes through a series of stages. Doesn't mean that the other stages disappear. You can still have a contest over politics, like the building of the Sokoto Caliphate, or the Sulu Empire in the southern Philippines. You still have states being built and people having movements that culminate in states coming into being. But you have other types of contests, other types of efforts to acquire power. And when you get down to 20th century, it's clear that we have a new set. And that new set is consonant with many of the aspects of social mobilization that we identify with the European tradition. But it also has room for religion. Doesn't mean religion's always there, or that it will always be the dominant form, or even the explicit form, but it will be there in some fashion. And ultimately, I think the Islamic historian who has a view on social mobilization is neither me nor Franz Rosenthal, but I think is Ibn Khaldun. Thank you very much.